Hi, everyone. I threw in this gold animation so that you know I'm a good designer. My name is Martin Keary. He's already done the introduction, so I'll rush through that because I've got a lot to get through and I have to stay on time. Thanks very much to FOSS Backstage for inviting me here and allowing me to speak. I have a lot to say about this particular topic because it's been something that I've been advocating for a while. And yeah, so I'll just get through it. So first, a little bit about me. I've worked on a few different open source projects throughout my career. The first was Ubuntu around 2001, 2000, what am I talking about, 2011, 2012, including the Ubuntu mobile operating system. Later on, in 2019, I took over a project called MuseScore, which is an open source score writing application for writing sheet music. It's used by millions of people around the world. And then in 2020, I took over Audacity, which I currently run as well. I run both MuseScore and Audacity right now. This is the version of Audacity we're working on. It's probably not the version that you're familiar with. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment because it'll be relevant, I think, to this talk. And also I run a YouTube channel called Tantacrul where I talk about design and music especially, but I do touch on open source design in a couple of my videos, and I'll play a clip from that a little later. So why am I doing this talk? Well, I'm playing to the gallery a little bit here, I know, but I'm planning on doing this for a video as well to extol the virtues of free and open source software to a really wide audience who might not know this stuff. But free and open source software is very, very important, and it's increasingly important. I know you're all aware of that, but one of my reasons for thinking so is there's rising income inequality around the world, and in the creative spaces that I'm involved in, I'm tired of hearing people say, oh, I would love to be able to participate in this or that, but I can't because I can't afford the plugins or I can't afford the software or something like that. I think that open source software should be trying to compete with proprietary software to bring prices down and also just compete in terms of functionality and capability. And I do believe that one of the areas that is in need of just general improvement is general design. Second reason is there's a lot of bad practices in open source, or rather in proprietary software. For example, PowerPoint, which I use to put this together, has this new feature I'm sure you've heard of called Copilot. And I clicked on it, and it does literally nothing. It is absolutely useless. And I polled a bunch of people about this as well, and the negative ratings for it were in the 90%. And the reason they're doing it, of course, is not because they're looking at what users want and what they need. It's because it sends their share price up, and they give us useless tools that don't serve our actual needs. Not, of course, always the case, but it is the case in a lot of the creative software that I use. And then there are predatory practices, like certain creative suites that form a monopoly, and then hike up the price and then make it a subscription service, et cetera, who I think need to be destroyed. And I think free and open source software can help to reduce that negative impact that I've just described. So a couple of clarifications just right off the bat. Probably doesn't need to be said, but this talk is mainly relevant to applications that have a GUI. Just thought I'd get that out of the way. And the second thing is that when I'm talking about design, I'm talking about product design rather than graphic design. It's another thing that I have heard a lot because I interviewed quite a lot of different project leads for open source software in preparation for this talk, and a few of them thought I was talking about things like icon design. And whereas graphic design is certainly a component of it, it's not the be-all and end-all. By product design, what I mean is that the person on the other side, the user, you're thinking about their entire experience, how they find out about the product in the first place, like the marketing, how they open it, how they install it, every aspect of its usability. You should be thinking about all this stuff as a product designer. And that's what I mean by product design, which I think is probably the best term that I can think of, slightly better even than UX design. You all good? OK. So what are the challenges? There's a couple of challenges I wanted to highlight. The first is that I think there's an insufficient general awareness of design best practice in the free and open source world. It's certainly by no means always the case. There's a few good examples, loads of good examples, one or two I'll touch on later. I'm just going to give one quick example. When I was still a contributor, when I was first asked to look at MuseScore, this is MuseScore 3.0, I opened it up and I started using it. So the first thing I did was went up here, clicked on one of these note durations, and went down to the score and tried to enter notes, and oh, can't do that. Try again, enter some notes. Oh, why can't I do that? And what I eventually realized was I had to click on this weird N button here first then click on one of the durations, and then I could enter something on the score. Might seem like a trivial little annoyance, but like writing notes on the stave is literally the core of a score writing application. I call this a WTF moment. You know, a moment where the user opens up the app and goes, what? Okay, go into Google, go onto a forum, figure out how to make this work. Now, I knew because I'm very familiar with this particular world, that in all the proprietary competitors, you click on the duration, all of them work this way, you can enter notes on the score. And I didn't see a good reason why MuseScore, had been out around 10, 15 years at that point, why it wasn't able to do that. So I asked, the community, and I suggested I created a spec for how this should work. And I asked them, isn't this a good idea? And I pointed out that Finale, Doroco, and Sibelius, the proprietary competitors, all do that. And the response I got from one or two people were, well, I don't use Finale. And I just thought, well, competitive analysis and looking at the wider domain is a really important aspect of design. You don't want to just not only reinvent the wheel, but reinvent a prototype wheel and then have to spend years kind of iterating on it until you get a wheel. You look at all the competitors, you look at design best practice, you look at the patterns that are out there, and you have a general kind of literacy around patterns and conventions, and then you build on top of that. You don't just lock yourself off from the proprietary world because you hate it. You try to do better than it. And that's what they do. And that is one example of really good design practice. Eventually, just may as well point it out, we did eventually do that. In fact, it was the first thing we did. So I'm showing MuseScore 4, which is maybe a bit unfair, but yeah, now it works that way. And we made a million other changes like that, so that when a user first comes to the app, they get what they expect. Second challenge is, and I think this is probably the thing I would point out as the most important thing, the biggest takeaway, is a neglect of long-term planning. So when I join a project, no matter if it's at the very beginning or midway, I'll think a lot about, okay, do we have a plan? Do we know where we're going? I like to do 3-year plans or 5-year plans, and I'll do that with the project leads, or I'll do it with whoever the stakeholders are, and we'll say, what is the total amount of features that we want? What are the total technologies that we want in 5 years' time? And then we'll sit around and we'll sketch out what that might look like, and quite quickly we'll see it's a bit of a Sudoku puzzle. Oh wait, we've got tons of options all fighting each other. Now we're going to have to work out the UX architecture. What's the hierarchy? What are the primary tools? What are the secondary tools? What should go in settings, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give a little example, I'm going to have to rush through this. But when we were doing Audacity, when I took that over, that was a very well-established project. It didn't have a plan beyond what the next release was going to be. So we set about establishing one. One thing we said we wanted to do was improve its core editing features. There was a lot of work to be done there. Secondly, we wanted to transform it into an excellent audio production tool. We surveyed a lot of our users at the outset, and we put a survey up on our website, got a lot of responses, and we found that a lot of people were using it for podcasting or other types of, other reasons that implied that there'd be, nicely produced audio at the end. But they couldn't really do that in Audacity, so Audacity was just sort of one step in that process. And we felt like, well, if new users are coming in, there's no reason why they can't export a really well-produced podcast in Audacity. So that's some of the stuff that we set, some of the principles that we set out at the outset. And we began sketching out what that might look like, moving things around. This is a bit ugly and all over the place, but it's just, you just quickly sketch things out. And then we did some more. This is to do with things like automation and recording from multiple inputs. We refined it a little bit. This guy up here is my pointer isn't working. Workspaces, how that might work. And then we began implementing. So this is Audacity 3.0, where I took over. I began doing some user tests on it. And I noticed that people had to click on this weird double arrow in order to move clips left and right. Every single person we tested did not know that that's how that worked. Moreover, they didn't even know that those things were clips, because you have these weird lines here, and that's not exactly indicative of a clip. So we were like, all right, well, let's fix that first. So we implemented these little affordances on top of clips, so you can move them left and right. That allowed us to get rid of that weird tool in the top bar, so it became less complicated. That tested perfectly. 5 out of 5 in terms of or rather, out of the 5 people we tested it on initially, 5 of them immediately understood how that worked. We implemented, in that same release, non-destructive audio editing, so that when you paste audio, you can still get it back. It doesn't get destroyed. It's another really important aspect of audio production. In Audacity 3.2, we implemented real-time effects that can be applied per track. Just, again, one of those things that allows you to tweak your production as you go through as you construct, let's say your audio, or rather, let's say your podcast or your project, and you can rearrange your effects, turn them off to hear how they sound without and with, and all that kind of stuff. Beyond that, we introduced the icon set that we were going to use. We knew we were going to use this icon set down the line, so we kind of introduced it early so people would be more kind of used to them by the time we switched over to a new interface. We introduced some musical features. That was another kind of goal. I decided not to talk about that at length. All right. And we introduced things like time signatures, tempo, time stretching, etc. We made a couple of improvements to the wave visualization, gave a couple of people different options for how the wave could be displayed, and we also implemented a mastering effects channel, which of course is crucial for production. It allows you to manipulate the final output. And we introduced a whole bunch of new real-time effects like this compressor. So you can see kind of like, step by step by step, we introduced all these things so that each release had a kind of a purpose. It gave the user something, but we always had a goal. We always had a vision of where we wanted to get to. And while we're doing this, we're able to move things around, figure out what refactoring needed to be done. And that, of course, that long-term planning is not just design planning, it helps the entire project. It helps the developers look and see, oh, well, we're going to have to integrate this new technology, we're going to have to move over to this UI toolkit or whatever. And then eventually, this is what we're working on now, we moved over to the new development environment, Qt, which is just a big requirement. We were previously working in WX widgets, and that's allowed us to make all kinds of additional improvements, like, for example, the ability to select multiple clips at the same time and group them together, just to name one. And that's just an example of like how I've done long-term planning. And when you do long-term planning, it allows you to iteratively, cleverly release and build the right things in the right order without kind of tripping over yourself, without kind of putting something somewhere and then realizing, oh no, I've accidentally blocked myself and I'm going to have to move that somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. Let me see, how am I doing for time? Grant. The next one is, I think there's a tension between decentralization and consistent design. I won't dwell on this for too long, but because I'll return to it later on. But when contributors are all, let's say, voluntary or volunteers, and they're all kind of, if there's no structure set in place, they can kind of do their own thing, and that can really fight and hurt consistent design practice if there's no plan, if there's no guidelines, etc. The fourth is there, and it seems a little bit similar to 3, but I'll explain. A preference for incrementalism over upheaval. And by upheaval, I don't mean a total redesign, and I mean taking a step back in order to take 2 forward, looking at something that's clearly not efficient or a constellation of relevant features that need to be rethought in order to make the app more simple. I think that that's more painful for open source projects because it means they have to lock off parts of the code. They have to tell certain volunteers, please don't touch this for the moment. They have to do a bit more organizational work, and that kind of hurts. And that's another kind of problem when a designer comes along. If there's no structure set in place to avoid it, a designer finds it extremely difficult to introduce good design practice when people are just chucking stuff in willy-nilly. Let me actually go back slightly. So here's a little video from my YouTube channel, just kind of explaining that point as it relates to MuseScore. But it's also talking about code architecture too. So I'm talking about design and UX architecture as well as the underlying code.
Different contributors would volunteer to take on parts of the remaining work and would submit their progress piece by piece to the whole group for review. It would then be up to Werner or Nicola, as the heads of the project, to accept or reject each submission. In the open source world, most contributions tend to be small, contained tweaks rather than large overhauls. This is practical because small changes are less likely to impact on someone else's work, which makes them much more likely to get accepted. This also suits the routines of open source contributors whose involvement is almost always part-time. But with a community as vibrant as MuseScore's, there were loads of people willing to take part. So, eventually, all these thousands of little fixes and suggestions came together after enormous amounts of testing and revision until a new stable release was ready. I've seen this process many times myself, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. However, as powerful as this system is, it does come with one major drawback: mounting architectural instability. I can best explain this using the metaphor of city planning. MuseScore was less a Singapore and more of a Houston, a free-for-all, where in order to build anything, you have to do your best to plug into whatever existing, uncoordinated and inefficient structures you find yourself sitting on top of. By the time we got to the end of development on MuseScore 3, which I spent a lot of time working on, it was an amazingly complex potpourri of thousands of patchwork improvements that depended upon and reinforced other patchwork improvements, all hanging together through a combination of workarounds, inefficient additional processes, and straight-up hacks. A massive technical debt, which practically speaking meant that if you tried to make a change to one thing, you'd break 7 other unrelated things in the process. And this is not a criticism of the MuseScore community, by the way. Far from it, actually. This structural problem is almost unavoidable and inherent to many open source applications, which often can't afford full-time developers to manage code quality, alongside experienced designers who can plan years in advance. Although it's not like professional companies regularly get this right either. Spaghetti code seems to be the norm everywhere. Like I remember once while working on Paint 3D, I asked a developer to change the color of a button from orange to blue. And when he did this, the orange option in the main color palette, that's the thing you use to paint with, also became blue, giving users 4 blues and no oranges.
Okay, so so I guess the point I'm making there obviously is that if you don't have any kind of structures in place, plans for where you want to go, design guidelines or design systems in place, the only thing contributors have to work with is the app itself. And they look at it and they go, oh, there's an empty space, I'll just plunk something there. Or there's a setting, I'll just add a setting there. And it becomes increasingly complicated. They just build on top of what exists already. And that's, I think, a problem to be overcome. And I'll talk about that again when I get to my solutions section. The last one is that I get contacted by designers, a reasonable amount, people who see the YouTube channel. Some ask, what can I do? Give me some advice about how I can get started. And I'll often say, find an open source project and try to contribute. And what I have heard back a few times, in fact, I've never heard the opposite of this. This is the only thing I ever hear back is, okay, well, I tried to join the project, and then I jumped on the chat room and I suggested a bunch of changes, and then a scary big dev told me no, said it was a really stupid idea, and I felt a bit scared. And I talked to a few other people, made some more suggestions, and no one would do it. And then I just lost interest and I left. And I think as well, there's another issue, which is that when you're working in GitHub and you're working in kind of like chat rooms and stuff, not exactly the most conducive space for a designer, especially when you're not all together kind of discussing stuff like on a team call or something like that. A lot of open source projects basically just haven't thought about how to be welcoming to designers, and that's another issue that I've seen quite a few times. But there are, of course, plenty of examples where that's not true. So a couple of best practices I wanted to go through, 5 of them. Let it move upwards. Here we go. Okay, so the first, I think is pretty obvious, is make design part of your community DNA. Meaning, I think a project needs to state very visibly for all contributors and community that they do embrace good design and UX and stuff like that. That's quite important, because when someone looks at your project and considers contributing, seeing that helps them to understand, well, that's actually a priority, and that can help to propagate throughout the entire developer community. There's also, of course, the example of publishing really good design guidelines. And I think this is actually more important for free and open source software than it is for companies who run proprietary software. Because if you have really good documentation, it'll then be taken by your community and spread, and also enforced, I think, a little bit as well. But you have to kind of build that into your community. So really good example is the GNOME project. They have some, apart from just looking really good, and it's obviously quite a good operating system, there's some really, really good resources online that I really like. They have some actual principles stated. They have a bunch of resources like, for example, widgets for your type ramp, which is great for like consistency, widgets for your color palettes, and because if you just choose random colors, it'll start to look all over the place. So if you lock it down like this, that's obviously a really, really good idea. And they got lots of accessible design principles as well, which is another thing that I noticed that free and open source software prioritizes way more than companies do. And that's a real big benefit also for education. I think any educational institution would rather bring in a free application for obvious reasons, but if it also catered to people with various different kinds of disability, that's an additional bonus. And that's another kind of power I think that free and open source software has, and one that I definitely embrace myself. The next one is to encourage prototyping and user testing. How am I doing for time? Grant. Prototyping, basically any PR you make or any PR a contributor makes which suggests some sort of change is a prototype. But user testing is something I don't think I've ever seen an open source project do, or at least I've never seen it kind of advertised. User testing is sort of the absolute core of how you figure out whether something is good or not. Now, if you get like 7 of the world's best designers in a room, they'll come up with 7 different visions for the thing you want to work on. And if you throw in a bunch of contributors and people who maybe aren't so experienced, you'll end up with all kinds of like groupthink, too many chefs, compromises. And the only way you can figure out what actually is working is to test it in front of real users and see how it's performing. Now, my favorite test, there's a bunch of different types you can do, is the first-time user test. So just before I was doing this talk, Inkscape got in contact with me and said they wanted me to do a tiny bit of work just to like suggest UX improvements for their app. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll do some user testing on it, and I'll do that also in preparation for this talk. So I talked to 5 users, and none of them had used Inkscape, but they were all artists of various different kinds. And I got to play a little clip from that. And there were 2 observations I had from this first clip. I want to see if you pull out the same conclusions I did. You'll probably pull out more. And then I'll show a second clip afterwards.
So I guess let's proceed, and just every single aspect of what you're experiencing, all of it is relevant. So just get going and tell me what you're thinking.
Okay. So I guess I'll stay in quick setups, probably the easiest thing to do. Canvas, default dark. So stick with default. Keyboard, I'm not really sure what that means.
The keyboard, I don't really know what that would do, so let's go with the default.
Canvas, default. Oh, okay, so I'm already confused why, like I don't know what all these keyboards do, so giving me this option immediately without explanation, it feels like a more advanced option, maybe. So that's just a thought. I assume that's like where my keyboard shortcuts are.
So we're going to get started here. We're going to keep in light mode because I'm not a gooner.
This person didn't say anything, just looked and then pressed new document. So I pulled out 2 main observations. First of all, that the options being put in front of them weren't particularly useful because everyone chose the default setting, except for the color. Actually, no one changed the color because it was set to their system settings, but no one actually changed anything. And everyone was confused by the keyboard thing, which I think is, I obviously went out of my way to highlight that. And that was interesting, so I thought right off the bat, well, when you open the app, first of all, I think you could greet the user a little bit better. But then I kind of thought a bit more about that, and this next clip helped me to kind of widen that thinking, and I'll play this. So the user is about to press a new document and then just wants to change the orientation of their artboard.
Recent files, so new document. New document. Okay, so we have a A4 page here. Okay, so I think I'll draw just like a childish scene of like grass and a tree and a house or something like that. So first of all, I'm thinking I want a landscape page. So icons up here. Edit, view, orientation. Here we go. Rotate clockwise. Oh, okay. I've done it by a small amount. Oh, sorry, hang on. Maybe if we do flip.
Fiddling around to see. Did I see a page tool at the bottom?
Pages tool.
What does that do?
Create and edit document pages.
Oh.
Nope. Done something. Okay, and change the size. I guess I could just make it a landscape. Yeah, that works.
Okay, so like I'm hearing kind of sympathetic groans and laughter in the same way that I had. So I know I'm talking to an audience who kind of get what I'm talking about here. But like obviously, that's like the last place anyone would look for that option. And what I also didn't notice is this dynamic bar up here actually does contain the dimensions which you can enter in. It's in millimeters. I'd probably go for pixels, but hey, if you can change it easily, that's not such a bad thing. I will actually say that the test was create a picture and export it as a PNG. And everyone did actually manage to do that. So there were aspects of this, quite a few, where people kind of got the overall UX architecture, but there was a couple of places, especially the orientation, where people really struggled. So I actually didn't do too badly overall, but I just pointed out two examples where it didn't do so great. But when I saw this, the first thing that occurred to me was like, that would be the thing you put in your opening. That would be the option you might like surface to a user. Something that's relevant to the project they want to open. The orientation and stuff like that. Rather than like, how would you like your checkerboard to be? Do you want it to be black? Like that's a really abstract kind of setting, and that would normally safely be tucked away in preferences, I would say. So that was just like one little example. So I'm going to send that. I haven't sent it to the team yet, so maybe I'll even send them this talk because I haven't had enough time. But yeah, user testing. It's just absolutely crucial. And I think that it could easily be done in open source spaces. Anyone can do user testing. It's often kind of extolled as this like this really, really specialist dark art. It's super simple. Jump on a Zoom call with someone or whatever type of call, record what they're doing on their desktop. Don't tell them anything about the app. Don't give them any tutorial at the outset. Give them an end goal and then just stand back and watch them do it. And I'll tell you way more than a million conversations with like a bunch of developers who often are very invested in the project and know like inside out. Now, I've already talked about this, create long-term plans and communicate them widely. I've mentioned, not only when you create long-term plans, not only is it good for your developers and your designers and your community of developers, but you can also communicate that to your users so they know what's coming, in the future, and they don't keep asking, release after release, when is this thing coming? When is this thing coming? It's just a natural coordination tool. The fourth one is empower your designers and establish a design leader. I've already spoken about empowering designers, as in make it clear that that's important to the project. Try to get other people to also understand that in your developer community. And also, I think you have to establish like a single vision. Now, you can have lots of people working on a project, and whatever way you want to establish a single vision, whether by voting or by investing power in someone who's kind of proved that they're really good, you do need to have one vision, and that vision needs to be enforced. There's a variety of different ways you could do it, which I won't go into, but I think that's super important. You can't just have like 7 different designers. I mean, you're very lucky if you've got 7 different designers in the first place, but if you do, as I said, you will have 7 different visions and constant bickering and arguing. You need one vision. And the last one is embrace creative destruction. And this is another real bugbear for me, and this is the very last point, which is like, if there's one thing I've seen time and time again, it's in any project I've worked on, it's that some contributor comes along with a really good idea for some sort of convention or some sort of change to the way the default behavior of some function works, and they suggest it, and then there's the obvious initial criticism is that's going to screw with the experience of existing users, of legacy users. And then what they end up doing, not always, but often, is they go, well, let's put it in preferences. So if they want that, they can turn it on in preferences, and then they can do the thing. No one goes to preferences to look for anything. Your default behavior is your behavior. If you shove something in preferences, you're basically enforcing the old standard on like 95% of your user base. Also, very few people watch tutorials. Very few people read manuals. The default behavior is your behavior, and that's the most important thing to understand. And think about like your overall number of users, the users you already have, who are already kind of like, probably going to have a bit more goodwill towards you, who might be willing to learn new things, but also your potential users, the people who come for the first time, the people who come, open your app, have like 5 WTF moments ago, you get what you pay for. You want to kill that feeling of you get what you pay for, because that is another kind of perception, I think, that exists, where people are like, well, it's free, it's volunteer, so obviously it's going to be crap. And I think that like needs to be stamped out. And it's stamped out very often by doing what a lot of proprietary software do, which is make hard decisions. If something is clearly better, make it your default. I would even opt, don't even put the other option in preferences. Yeah, but do if you think it's necessary. Try to have as few preferences as possible and move forwards sometime. Don't just keep holding on to legacy stuff just because you think you have to, because it's going to, make your legacy user base happy. And that's really the last point. How am I doing for time? I'm doing not too badly, 1 minute over. And that's it, really. So I'll leave it there. So thanks very much for listening to my talk. Thank you.
All right. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I see some hands up. Let me walk.
Thanks a lot for your talk. doing user tests in open source for more than 20 years now. Sorry for not advertising it loud enough. I found two fundamental problems I'd like your opinion how to address. First of all, for doing user tests, I need to have a representative, an idea of how my user base is set together or compiled to not what, in my experience, happens is that we usually test white old men that use the software, which is kind of contradictory to the inclusive idea of open source. And the second thing is, I think the example of Inkscape, even though I don't want to question your findings about sort of the startup of Inkscape, Inkscape is a productive tool for people that are experts. And I think that sort of the first use aspect of Inkscape is not really sort of the, I mean, it's an interesting aspect, but it's not a crucial or not the important optimization criteria. So you only get sort of the first use optimization criteria when you do user tests. So I'd like to know your thoughts about this.
I mean, like with Inkscape, I mean, first of all, I mean, vector drawing programs are super complicated. I don't think they need to be. I think that the world has moved on from Adobe Illustrator using conventions from like almost 30 years ago. I do agree that there's a certain level of kind of knowledge you need to have, but everyone I brought in had already experience of artboards, drawing applications and stuff like that. I didn't bring in just like random people who had no experience of this kind of thing. Also, like I stand by the examples I gave. Like, those were clearly, obviously things that could be improved. So even if, let's just agree with you that it's a specialist tool, I kind of half agree. I think it could be a much more intuitive tool. There could be systems set in place to explain to people the difference between like vector path drawing and, let's say, pixel drawing. But there's obviously way further you could go. I think that you could still make it much more intuitive. You could still do user testing on that. I mean, you have to set. You're right that you have to be realistic about what the project is and who it's for, and then within that criteria, you then user test to pursue the goals of the project. So sometimes there are like projects like Blender, like clearly that's not like a general usage tool. So I accept that point. But yeah, now to the other question about like, I think you're asking like, how do you like recruit good users for user testing? Basically, I mean, I don't know if I have a really good answer. I mean, the way that I do it, but that's a luxury that I have, is I have a decent like following on social media. I'll put out stuff on Twitter. I mean, well, I'm now doing it on Blue Sky and on, I hate using Threads, but I sometimes use that because I prefer that over Twitter. And I'll say, hey, I'm doing some user testing of X. If you've never used this app before, please contact me and then we'll set up a time. Or I'll go like, hey, if you're an existing user, we want to try out this new build. We want to see what you think of it, et cetera, depending on the type of user that we want. Pretty much like comms, like social media is a super important component of open source design and open source projects in general. I think pretty much you just have to put effort into trying to build up an audience of people who might be interested in doing user testing. You need to just go to different spaces and talk about it. It's a tricky one, but it's one that I've not had a problem with. But then again, I have the luxury of having a reasonably decent following of people who who'll come to me and volunteer to do user testing. I would say that like if you do want to do user testing, I mean like no one's ever come to me and said, hey, could you possibly just announce that we're doing user testing for this thing? I would happily do that. I do announce other things for free and open source software. Because I just see it as my duty to do so. So maybe that's another thing you could do, is just find people who have big audiences who are sympathetic to open source software. Just do whatever you can to try and get your message out so that you recruit people for user testing. But it is a tough problem, I do accept that.
Thank you. Do we have any other question? Very quick. There we go.
Thank you very much. I was curious. I got Audacity in 2007 in a free CD in a magazine, so I really love to see what you're doing. But beyond that, do you accept contributions which are not code contributions to MuseScore or Audacity, and how do you handle these design contributions?
Design contributions to Audacity. How do we handle design contributions?
Yes.
Well, so we have another luxury, which is that we're backed by a company. I'm hired to run this project, and that is an advantage that I have. So what we do is, when designers come along and they want to take part, we usually set up calls with them. We do it with loads of different contributors, including developers as well. We'll set up calls with them. We'll kind of like walk them through our conventions, and we'll sort of usually we'll mentor them a little bit. And we do have like specific like developers who mentor other developers on code quality and on our conventions. And when designers come along, we do the same thing. I'll often then just because we work remotely, so we'll just invite people into our calls. Like our weekly design meetings and stuff like that too. That's how we handle it.
Thank you.
Okay, that is our time. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Martin.
Okay.